Welcome back to another episode of Cape Ann Today. We are going to start our conversation today talking about dams and seawalls, particularly dams right now, because the rain has been sort of biblical. And there was a map in today's Boston Globe that showed dams across the state and the ones and their condition and their hazard level. And there were a few in Gloucester. So Senator Tarr, tell us what you know about dams.
Well, first of all, dams don't get a lot of attention usually. We take them for granted in our lives and we don't think about them unless there is a situation where there's an emergency. And that emergency oftentimes occurs when we have a lot of rain and there's a concern that the dam won't be able to effectively contain the body of water that it's designed to protect. However, it is important to know that the state, through the Department of Conservation and Recreation, does facilitate inspections of dams. And that's why in that Globe story, there were ratings that were the result of those inspections. And there is a lot of conversation that happens in the regulatory world about trying to keep dams safe. In addition to that, it's always interesting to think about the fact that not all dams are in the public domain. And oftentimes a dam might be owned by a private landowner. And oftentimes the dam might not be serving necessarily a public interest, so it may not get as much attention as a publicly owned dam, but they're all important. And among other things, the reason that they're important is because if they fail, the unleashing of the body of water that they're holding back can cause a tremendous amount of damage and risk to public safety. And so a number of years ago, Heather, I worked in the legislature with my colleagues to create a dam and seawall fund. And in fact, initially, it was intended to be only for dams, and I worked to amend the legislation and amend the law to ensure that it was for both dams and seawalls, because they both are important and they both can cause significant threat if they fail or if they're at risk of failing. And so now we have a fund, and in fact, in Governor Healy's most recently announced capital improvement plan, or capital investment plan, which stretches from fiscal year 24 to fiscal year 28. It's a rolling plan. There is $63 million for this purpose, and that will be split roughly between dams and seawalls. And what's interesting about that is among the dams and seawalls that were noted in the Globe article, and particularly the dams, there are some that in Gloucester have had significant state investment. In fact, most recently, and I just was looking at the press release on February 9th of this year, there was a $99,000 grant for additional work at the Haskell Pond Dam in West Gloucester. And that dam has been the subject of considerable work and it also has received multiple grants from state government, from the Dam and Seawall Fund, because it's a very large dam. And it also constrains a body of water that's used for municipal drinking water supply. And so that one has had significant investment. And then I'm not going to recall the accurate name of it, so I'll confess that in advance, but the dam that is over near Poplar Park and also deals with a public water supply has had a lot of work and significant state support over the last few years as well.
And so we were talking before, and you were talking about how, you said it already, but I'm going to emphasize again, one of the big problems is that you don't have the authority to repair, as the state does not have the authority to repair these private dams. And there were a couple of those listed in the Globe story.
Well, that's correct. And the private dams are in a little bit of a different situation because without ownership, the government, either local or state or federal for that matter, doesn't have the authority to enter the premises and make repairs. The one exception to that I have heard referenced and not seen practiced a lot is the emergency power that the Department of Conservation and Recreation has to be able to effect emergency inspections and emergency repairs, so that if there is a serious threat that's posed by the potential compromise of a dam, then there is emergency authority to effect only the repairs that are necessary to abate the emergency. And so private dams oftentimes find them in a much different situation, oftentimes because their owners don't have the resources to effect the kind of large-scale repairs that are needed to bring them to a state of good repair. And so oftentimes it's a very delicate discussion that happens between the owners of private dams, if they can be identified, which is also sometimes an issue, and the folks that are responsible in our state and local governments for keeping them safe.
Okay, so here's a really practical question. $99,000 that went to the Haskell Pond Dam that was allocated February 9th. Who does that work? Who fixes a dam?
It's most often done by an independent contractor that's contracted by the city of Gloucester. Sometimes the DPW will effect minor repairs, but most often it's done by a contractor with expertise in this kind of work.
So are they water engineers? What kind of expertise are we looking at when we need someone to fix a dam?
So it depends on the issue, but there's almost always an engineer involved at the heart of this, because you're dealing with a tremendous amount of hydraulic pressure and load on the dam. And so those are the kinds of structures that need careful scrutiny and careful plans. So there's almost always an engineer involved. And then beyond that, I think there can be a whole host of vendors and personnel that get involved with the repair.
All right, well, let's change subjects. Let's talk about revenue collections. In May, we have good news.
We do. When we last talked about revenue collections, we were talking about what had happened in April, which is one of the largest months for revenue collection for obvious reasons. That's when our taxes are generally due. And we talked about the fact that we had a significant shortfall. And we were speculating that that might have been a one-time event for a couple of different reasons, one of which was the use of pass-through tax credits by a number of the folks that were entitled to use them. And I won't go back and revisit all of the details of that, but we thought that those credits got used, that significantly adjusted our revenue. So we turned to May, and we were looking at May revenue estimates in our office just over the last couple of days, and there is good news. And the good news is that the total collections were about $2.7 billion, and that was about $236 million more than we collected last May. That's about a 9.5% increase. But even more importantly, for this year's benchmark, the number that the budget is based on, those numbers are $169 million above benchmark. So it appears that we're back on a path of exceeding our benchmark. Certainly, the $1.8 or so billion that we were short in April has not been overcome, but at least we're moving in a positive direction.
And we were saying words like windfall and sort of the Massachusetts miracle, I think, last year. Are we feeling like we're still on track for that?
I think we still will. And there's a very significant reason for that. I think we're still going to end the year, but although it's difficult to predict, so I'm going out on a limb here, but I think we will. But part of what's important to recognize here is that there were two components to the shortfall in April that accounted for most, if not all of it. One was the use of pass-through tax entity credits, and the other one was the shortfall in capital gains. And what's important about the capital gains component of that is that in Massachusetts, we have for a number of years capped how much of our capital gains tax collections go into the general fund, go into the funding the state budget. The majority of them, those that are over the cap, go into the stabilization fund, the so-called rainy day fund. So the shortfall affected the rainy day fund more than it affected the budget. So we have a less number to overcome when it comes to ordinary revenue and funding the budget than we do in the stabilization fund. Now, that doesn't mean that we're without consequence. And you and I were also talking off air about the fact that we are likely going to make a significantly lower contribution to our stabilization fund for this fiscal year than we have in recent years and that we expected to make. And that's because we had that shortfall in capital gains. Those revenues are reserved for the stabilization fund, and that translates into a lower deposit into the fund. We will still make a deposit into the stabilization fund, and we will still likely have, in fact, I feel pretty confident saying we will have the largest stabilization fund balance, I believe, that we have had in the history of the Commonwealth, but it won't be what it would have been if we had collected capital gains tax revenue of the magnitude that we had expected.
Yeah, I mean, the stabilization fund, when you and I first started to talk, was like $2 billion. Is that right?
It was even less than that. And the reason for that was because during the pandemic, we had to adjust state government revenues and we had to draw from the stabilization fund. In fact, what we had feared at the onset of the pandemic, as we look back to the time around 2019, 2020, our fear was that we were going to completely drain the stabilization fund. That didn't happen. We actually were able to preserve some amount of money in it, between $1.5 billion and $2 billion, and then begin to rebuild fairly quickly. And the last couple of years, we've had very significant contributions to it, so that we now have, again, order of magnitude. I think when we finish this fiscal year, we'll probably be in excess of $7 billion, which is a number that just a few years ago, none of us would have thought even possible. But again, we had expected to deposit about $1.5 billion into the stabilization fund at the conclusion of, actually, we have concluded that fiscal year now because we're into fiscal year 2024. We thought we were going to have a much larger deposit, but it doesn't appear that that's going to be the case now.
Well, sometime we have to have a show just having a conversation about how that all happened. How going into COVID, there was the fear that that fund would be completely drained. And here we are looking at almost 9 billion.
We're going to be at least 7 billion. I'm trying to look at some numbers here, just glancing down quickly. But I would say that we are going to be, we currently have a balance of $7.22 billion. And I would say that we are going to probably eclipse $8 billion, but it won't be the 9 billion that you would reference, that where we thought we were going to be. But the stabilization fund is one of the most important elements of our state government's funding picture. And it's one that doesn't get a lot of attention because it is quietly there in the event that we need it, and if there's a disruption in revenue, like there has been during the pandemic. But it doesn't get a lot of attention other than that because you don't see large amounts of spending from it. So it's not as glamorous, but it's something that I always pay attention to, and that as a member of the Ways and Means Committee, that committee always pays attention to. And if you tune into Senate debates, you will oftentimes hear the Senate Chair of the Committee on Ways and Means, Senator Mike Rodrigues, and I have colloquies about the state of the stabilization fund at any given time, because we're always watching it and it's always important. So it'd be great at some point to break that down. And we might even be able to bring some visual aids that we could screen share and kind of show you some graphic depictions of the history of it.
I would love to do that. All right, let's make a date for that.
Okay.
Right. Do you want to give us any updates on that state budget? The fiscal 20.
I wish I could give you an update. We do not have a state budget. It is still in negotiations. And as we've talked about from time to time, we also do not have a Chapter 90 bill for road and bridge assistance to cities and towns. And yet we're at least midway through the summer construction season. And that is certainly a concerning thing. And I'm not sure if I mentioned the last time we talked, but my House counterpart, Representative Brad Jones, who was the House Minority Leader, Brad Jones and I sent a letter on behalf of our respective caucuses to the conferees, asking them to at least release part of the bill in a conference committee report and continue deliberating on another part, because generally speaking, we do about $200 million a year for basic road and bridge funding to our cities and towns. And what Representative Jones and I have asked for is for those dollars to be released, while the other $150 million, give or take, gets continually negotiated on an ongoing basis in the committee. We haven't had a response yet, but we're at least trying to get some movement on that bill, because time is of the essence, and the construction season does not last year-round in New England. We know that, and it's certainly not the case in Massachusetts.
Right, right. Well, thank you for everything. And I look forward to having a talk about the stabilization fund sometime. So let's figure that out and stay dry.
Well, you too. And I look forward to that. And I did have an opportunity to talk to Corey over the weekend, because there was a wonderful Howard Blackburn event at Maritime Gloucester. And we discussed maybe doing a remote together at some point, which I would love to do sometime soon before the winter weather comes, where maybe we can be in a picturesque place and discuss some interesting subjects. And I very much look forward to doing that.
Me too. So I understood you read a chapter of the Joe Garland piece, The Lone Voyager, right?
And I was happy to do so. As we may have discussed, I am a huge fan of the Howard Blackburn story. I think it's something that should be taught to all of our school children, all of our students, because it's a story that resonates with virtues and principles that are important as much now as they were then, about survival and being able to sustain in difficult times, but also being generous to your neighbors around you. And I think those are things that are important. And hats off to Maritime Gloucester and Gloucester 400 for a great event where we read passages from another very distinguished author in Gloucester, and that was Joe Garland, who was a friend to many of us before his passing. And it certainly was a great experience and a great event. And it was great to see the timeline piece that Corey has put together on the life of Blackburn, which I know will be featured on all of 1623's many venues very soon. And I look forward to watching it again and again when that happens.
Yeah, it's a wonderful piece. Well, thank you again. And we will do all of that very soon.
Very good. Thank you so much, Heather. And I hope you have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Interested in a sponsorship? Email sponsor@1623studios.org to learn more.